All right, so this block, we're going to start talking about learning outcomes. So we're going to go over the outcomes versus goals, how they look maybe a little bit similar, but what are the main differences between those. We're going to talk about why are we spending a whole block on learning outcomes for online courses? So why are they so important? We're going to talk about how to write strong online course learning outcomes. So maybe what different things we might like to do specifically for the online audience. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how the online learning outcomes can feed into other components and other parts of your course that you're going to build out, like assessment and activities, and how all of those things are going to align. So here, once again, these are our course level learning outcomes for this intensive course. So we talked about the first one last session, and for this session we're going to focus on the second one. So how to create meaningful, specific, and measurable learning outcomes. So this is something that you guys can all expect to do by the time that we're done with our block 2 today. Okay, so to jump right in, we're going to start right off the bat with learning outcomes. What are they? Why do we care? Why are they important? And really, again, like I said before, why are we spending a whole block on doing just this topic? So I will argue, and I think Kim will probably agree with me, that learning outcomes are one of the most important building blocks in terms of your course design, and to get started with thinking about your online course, what it's going to look like, and where are you going to take the students on this learning journey. They're important for all courses, right? So you probably are not unfamiliar with learning outcomes as a general concept. You probably already have been writing them for many of your courses. It's common practice nowadays for most faculty and most departments. But Kim and I will argue that they are particularly important for the online modality for a number of reasons. The first being that it is communicating to your students sort of your expectations and your roadmap for the course right off the bat. So one of the things you guys talked about in the Best Course Ever activity a couple hours ago was that you need to make sure that everything's clear for your students. You want things like transparency. You want a lot of communication with your students. You want to make sure everybody's on the same page and everybody knows what's going on. And so learning outcomes are the first step in doing this for your course. They don't do it all alone. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of the instructional strategies that you pick and the assessments that you pick. But it's one of the first things that a student is introduced to in your online course. And it's one of the first things that can really set those expectations and kind of alert them to the destination and the path that your course is going to take. So right from the start, you're sharing with your students, where are we going in this course? How are we going to get there? And how will we know when we've gotten there at the end? So you're sharing all of that with your students, and by sharing very clear expectations through your learning outcomes. Learning outcomes also help your students to learn, in that they are helping your students focus on the most important knowledge and skills that they're going to learn in your course. So they're not necessarily joining a course and not knowing maybe what they're going to learn, right? You're sharing with them right from the beginning, so everybody's on the same page. It also helps you as a faculty member to design the rest of your course out. So if you've got good, strong learning outcomes as that one of those first building blocks for your course, it kind of gives you a foundation for designing the rest of the online activities that you're going to choose, and for assessments that you're going to pick for your course. So it signals to you, it signals to your students, it signals to others in your department and your profession what you're doing, how you're getting there, and then how you're going to assess it once you've gotten to the end. Does that make sense to everybody? Cool, I see some nodding heads.
I just joined you, sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Yes,
We're
it makes
learning
sense.
outcomes. All right, cool. So basically, one of the reasons that they're more important in an online class is that you're setting a sense of intentionality. with your teaching for your students, and transparency and all of those things that you guys talked about this morning. So Kim's going to take over for a little bit. There she is. Okay. And she's going to talk about the differences for you guys between goals and outcomes, because sometimes the line can get a little bit blurred, but she's going to clarify that for us.
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard a lot of these words thrown out there: goals, outcomes, objectives, learning targets. There's lots of different names for the similar things. Some people prefer one over the other. We're going to use the term outcomes instead of objectives. It's just how I was trained academically and professionally, and how Ashley was too. So we're going to stick with outcomes. If we slot in outcomes with objectives, we mean the same thing. So we're going to, we know that you already know how to do all of these things. We know that you already know how to create goals, that you already know how to create learning outcomes. We want to create a common understanding of what we mean when we talk about these things moving forward, which is what we're going to do now. And as Ashley said, having these be very clear for learning outcomes, or for your online course, is incredibly important, because we don't have that in-person ability to be able to gauge or explain more or anything like that. So our students are kind of islands, and we're trying to reach them through this way. So goals. First of all, goals are mainly for you. They are instructor focused. These are the things that I want to accomplish. They're often quite intangible. They are abstract in nature. They're very high level. They're written from your perspective. They are really hard to measure in and of themselves, right? They are broad. Think broad. When you hear goals, think broad. And then outcomes. Outcomes are specific statements that are very much more measurable. They're specific. You can observe them. They're written from the student's perspective. So goals, we'll have a couple of examples here, but goals are for you, outcomes are for students. They really do help you craft your course from the very beginning for the online space here. And I also, too, I like to think of outcomes as an invitation for your students to become a part of this expertise here. So you are an expert in your field. You know a lot, have been trained a lot. You know a lot of these things. Your students don't, though. And so what you are trying to do is you are trying to create a foundation of knowledge, a toolkit, if you will, of actions and things that they can then take, and then have that invitation to be able to become a part of that expert, community. I think that it sounds very poetic, but I do think that this is an invitation to become a part of the community, of a knowledge bringing community here. And these are the things that you'll need to be able to do that. All right, so let's take a look at these here. These are some statements that you might see in a course. Do you think these are goals or outcomes? Oh, it gave it away. That's okay. These are goals.
Sorry, my computer is really struggling with the slides right now. I don't know what's going on here.
That's okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. So you'll notice that the language is very much focused on the instructor, right? Introduce students to the cultural values. Encourage students to think about, learn about key principles of biochemistry. And these are very much more higher level things, big picture statements, right? Like when I say, as an instructor, let's say I am a writing instructor and my goal is to improve their understanding of the components of satiric writing. What does that mean for a student? That means a lot to me as an expert, but I need to operationalize that just a little bit more for my students. Okay, and then outcomes. So these are written for students. This is student-centered learning, essentially. This is a really good example of that, where the students would be able to say, I will be able to describe the relationship between Bloom's taxonomy and the writing of student learning outcomes. I will be able to interpret classroom scenarios using key concepts and principles from behavioral, cognitive, and motivation theories. These I think are much clearer. These are things too that as an instructional designer and as an instructor myself, I can start to see the assessments that would come out of this. Like the design a system in R. That to me, I know how my students will be able to achieve that. I'll have a pretty clear sense of what that means for them.
All right, so now that we've kind of got some of the differences between goals and outcomes set up, the next question comes in: what makes a good learning outcome? How do we write them? So we talked a little bit, or Kim talked a little bit about, you know, the level of kind of specificity is a big factor. Writing them from the student's perspective is a big factor, but what else goes into it? So we've got some recommendations here on this slide. Again, sorry, I don't know why it's not loading up properly. So one of them, the first in the pink box, one of the ways to write a good learning outcome is to make sure it has an observable action verb. So not just an action verb on its own, you want something that's observable and measurable. So something you can see a student doing, or collect maybe a product from the student once they've done it. So that's a big one. Also, you want to make sure your outcomes are SMART. SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So I'll get a little bit into the details of that on the next slide. But you've probably heard this is going around a lot for people who do like personal goal setting. If you hear a lot about that on the internet or in your circles, SMART is a big acronym that's going around, but it applies to learning outcomes as well. You want something that matches the sophistication of your course. So Kim will talk a little bit about Bloom's taxonomy. We as instructional designers love Bloom's taxonomy. And that sort of gives you a visual of the sort of lower order thinking skills and higher order thinking skills. So what observable actions are a little bit simpler to do and which are a little bit more sophisticated and require a higher level of skill and knowledge than others. So you want to make sure that if you're teaching an intro kind of class, maybe a Psych 101 or whatever class department you're teaching in, you want something that relies a little bit more on some of those simpler actions. If you're teaching a senior seminar or maybe grad students, you want to rely a little bit more in your outcomes on those higher order thinking skills. You're always going to have a blend, right? So you don't need one or the other exclusively, but you want to kind of think and make sure that you're including both and it matches the level of your course and of your expectations of your students. You also want to think about outcomes that are authentic and experiential. So think about different issues or skills or knowledge that a student would have to know to basically go out into the community within your field. So if they were to get a job within your field, or even to go on to other courses in a particular sequence, what skills are the most important and the most authentic for them to be able to succeed and become a part of that community? So that's something to think about as well. And then we have this box here, what else? Do you guys, you know, in your experience of learning outcomes, what other tips or guidelines have you guys followed when writing your outcomes? Does anybody want to share? You can share in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and speak. Anybody?
Hi, Ashley. Can I say something? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I usually sort of add something. Instead of just describe or explain, this course will explain or describe. I usually like to use the word analyze. I think it helps the students really come to grips with the idea of analytical thinking, analytical, rigorous thinking, which is thinking of a problem from different perspectives. And I sort of call that critical thinking, essentially. You think of the problem from different perspectives. There's really no one answer to a problem. There are as many different sort of analytical sort of ways to approach a problem. And the other way is sort of one of the outcomes of this course is it helps you, as far as my courses are concerned, it helps my students write creatively, write
Okay.
analytically, come up with cogent sort of analysis and arguments from start to finish. Those are the things that I usually like to push in my learning outcomes.
Yeah, great. So those are definitely good things in terms of what the university is looking for. So not only you guys as individual instructors, but also the institution as a whole is really trying to develop students who can become good citizens of the world. We hear about that a lot. And one of the criteria of that is being able to think and analyze critically and to be able to take information and synthesize it and develop your own thoughts and opinions. So those are great. I saw in the chat box the HOTS and LOTS thing. So I was talking about lower order thinking skills and higher order thinking skills, but I didn't explain what the acronym is that goes with it. So LOTS is the lower order thinking skills, HOTS, higher order thinking skills. And Kim's going to review that in just a couple slides when we go through Bloom's textbook.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, right. Okay. Hello, everyone. May I just add something to what the last person said?
Sure.
And it has to do with, you know, I've been teaching at AU for 23 years, and I think sometimes students come in with an assumption that theory is over here and the real world is over here, sort of the experiential thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tried to get them to understand that you can't really have something called evidence without some basic theoretical framework that you're using. There's a difference between data and evidence. And so when we say data-driven doesn't really mean anything as such. Well, it does, but there's a movement from data to evidence, and evidence can only come through arguments that are made within, in relation to a specific body of academic literature.
Mm-hmm.
I find that probably one of the hardest things to overcome, because students, generally speaking, they're not that open to theory, because they said ideas like, what would that do for me in the working world?
Mm-hmm.
When you go into the working world, you don't stop thinking analytically, right?
Right.
So that's a big part of what I do, is to let them appreciate the relationship between theory and, so to speak, the experiential world that is out there.
Yeah, no, that's great. So that goes, but that feeds into what Kamal said as well, like you mentioned as you started speaking, but also this sort of lots and hots idea, right? So we're not only focusing on a skill of how to do something, but also the theory behind it. Why are we doing it? What have people done who have come before, and how all of that blends together. That's great.
The other idea too I talk a lot about experts versus novices, because you know, this is a perfect example. A university level course is a perfect example of novices and experts, and the differences in how their knowledge is constructed. And I believe it was Randolph, you were talking about how students have a hard time seeing the connections between theory and their lives. And that is a hallmark of novices. Novices have a very hard time connecting these abstract concepts to their own kind of experience and situate it there, because they haven't been really trained to do that. And so the idea and how you do that is you train them, like you were talking about, like making the connections, making it obvious, because to you as an expert, it is very obvious as to what these connections are. And even when Ashley and I are planning this course, we have a hard time stripping down what's the basics of instructional design for online classes, because we do this all the time. And so, I mean, I think what you're talking about, making it experiential, bringing it into the real life, you know, what does this mean for me, will help students see value. And we'll talk about value more tomorrow. But this experts versus novices conversation is this whole body of knowledge and field where they just examine the differences between the two. And so I'll probably keep bringing them up, because this is the perfect example of that. The online, the university level classroom is the perfect example of that.
Yeah, definitely. And feeding into that, Samuel in the text box was talking about in lower level courses, you can really focus on sort of discovery of a field or of the skills that are going to be needed later at the expert level. So focusing on those sort of smaller skills and pieces of all of that, and how then later the students can piece them together as they become more expert in a particular topic. That's great. All right.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I teach history, so when I think about the outcomes, I often think about what I want my students to learn specifically. So one of the outcomes I want them to have is to be able to identify significant time, event, and people, and explain why those events or people are significant. So that's what I want to share about the outcomes.
Yeah, that's another great example of sort of focusing on what's most important for a student to learn at that level and at that point in time in the course of their studies. That's great.
Another thing too to think about when writing outcomes is, what do you want your students to be able to do at the end of the course, a year from now, and 5 years from now? So what are the things that you think will be relevant to them in their own fields or whatever they choose to go into as well? What are the things that are really kind of, what would success look like? And that's what outcomes are.
Yeah, that's great. Anybody else for sort of recommendations for writing outcomes or want to share what they do? All right, we'll move on to the next. So we're going to talk a little bit more about SMART learning outcomes. So again, SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. But this is sort of a set of guiding questions to get you to think about exactly how to formulate a learning outcome within this SMART framework. So for specific, you want to make sure that it's clear to your students exactly what is expected of them. So on that slide before that Kim was showing that had all of the list of outcomes, she was saying, okay, as a student, I can read this outcome and know that at the end of the course, I can do X, Y, and Z. So that's a good way to measure specificity. Is it clear? If you were a student, would you know what exactly you're going to be asked to do? Measurable is thinking about kind of tying into those action verbs that we talked about a little bit. You want an observable action verb because you want to be able to know that the student can do something, right? If you pick certain verbs, which we'll talk about later, you might not be able to measure it because you might not be able to see or know that they can do that particular thing. Achievable, this ties into kind of what we were just talking about with the novice versus expert and the folks who were sharing about the types of outcomes that they introduce for different level courses. You want to make sure that they can actually achieve it. You know, you don't want to have an intro course where you're saying, you know, maybe an intro to business where they have to create an entire huge business plan. You know, you want to make sure that they have the smaller pieces that they can tie together, and then later maybe they can do that task. You want to make it relevant. You want to think about what is your threshold for success. How do you know a student has met that outcome? And what criteria must they meet in order for you to consider it met? And then time bound, you want to make sure your students can achieve those particular things during the unit of time that you're spending with them or during the course of the course itself. So those are some things to think about with SMART goals. So Kim, oh, sorry.
No,
you're good. Okay, so Kim's going to talk to you now about Blues.
Hi, Ashley. Hi,
Sure.
Kim. Can
Hi.
I say something before you go on to the next point, please?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. You know, I really like this idea of relevancy because I think sort of you can coin it on two different levels. One, academically, in relation to other courses they may have been taking in the same field or in the same department.
Yep.
As you may know, I teach in the government department. So a lot of times I try to apply a lot of these principles that I'm teaching about in my narrow courses to broader political science or government courses, things that they are taking elsewhere, so they can relate the relevancy of my course to other courses as well. But the other thing you said, Ashley, was right on the point, right on the spot, is this concept about, well, how does it relate really to future careers in that field? I think that's really important. So it's not a question of just at the academic level relevancy to other courses they are taking during that semester or throughout their sort of academic experience, but also when they go out in the cold world out there. I spent 31 years of government service, so I can relate a lot of my experiences in government professionally to what they can expect from the courses that I'm actually putting before them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, thinking about and isolating the things that have been helpful for you in your professional life or what you've talked about with others or as an academic, absolutely. You know, we're not, I think that some people talk about college as not real life, but students are working, they are managing their own time, they're doing project management, and you know, they are trying to figure all of this out so that when they continue to move through their trajectory academically, professionally, et cetera, they have the abilities to be able to do the things that are expected of them later. We're not, you know, this isn't an isolated experience with our classes that we have. We need to think about this exactly like you were saying, Kamal, where these things, you know, there are lots of different conditions and things that interact at every point in their lives. And so how can we make this particularly relevant for them too? You know, yeah, we'll keep going.
Okay.
I don't want to spoil it. Thanks, Kamal, for sharing.
Oh, thank you.
And so then, you know, where do you start with all of this? We like to point people, and a really good practice for instructional design is to think about the end in mind too. So it's sometimes you'll hear it referred to as backwards design. I don't like calling that because that implies that it's backwards, and when I think this is the way that it should be anyway. Ashley's heard me say that so many times. She's laughing, I can see her. But it's the idea where you've got the target in mind. What do I want my students to be able to do? And then how can I know that they've achieved them? That's what we're trying to do with learning outcomes here. And then these actions here, these action groups that you can see on Bloom's taxonomy, can help you determine whether or not they have met those goals, right? Those outcomes. So Bloom's taxonomy, sorry, most of you have probably seen this. I give this out like candy on Halloween. Bloom's taxonomy is a cognitive representation of the difficulty of tasks. So at the bottom, you have understand and remember. Those are what Ashley referred to as lower order thinking skills, or LOTS. Those are foundational knowledge. They take very little cognitive effort to perform. They are critical, though, to have a solid foundation before you move up. So this is a representation that we created in CTRL, and the staircase is on purpose, right? You need to have that solid foundation before you can move up to the top. So then we move into apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. As you move up the stairs, the complexity of the task increases, which means that the amount of cognitive energy that it takes to perform these actions increases as well. So you've got all the way at the top, you know, designing something takes much more cognitive energy than explaining something. And there is value in all levels of these taxonomies, particularly when you take into account where students are in their academic trajectory. So if you have freshmen who are just coming into college, who are really new, really green, you know, it's okay to stay towards the bottom here. If it's a foundational course, absolutely. If you've got seniors who are working in maybe a capstone course, then maybe you ask them to complete more things here at the top. But again, you need to have you need to establish a solid common foundation for all students so that they can move up in that. This is a really great resource to be able to pull different verbs out of. This was devised by Bloom and was revised by Anderson and Krathwohl later. This is just a representation that we've created here. Does anyone have any questions about Bloom's taxonomy before we move on? I have this printed out. I use this all the time. At my desk at work, I have a couple copies of this that are laminated. I use this all the time to write learning outcomes. We use this when we wrote the learning outcomes for here. It makes it really easy to start crafting those. This is the updated version. This is the 2001 version. So you might have seen two different versions of this.
So Kim, so we have a question in the chat box about where would synthesis fall on this?
Yes, so synthesis is probably, it would be in, so it might be in the older version of this. This is the updated version of this.
Maybe Kim, in the analysis,
yeah.
No? In the analysis.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably in the middle there, but it's been revised a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to kindly say something very quickly. I really love the idea of create, that sort of the top sort of the hierarchy. And I tend to encourage students also to think originally, and they really don't know what that term means. Think originally about something, especially towards the end of your essay. You know, when you come to the conclusion, don't just drop the ball, just sort of squeeze a little bit harder and come up with something original to say about, well, where do we go from here? What's the next step? What are some of the challenges? And so on and so forth. And that's where this create comes in. Am I right to assume that, Ashley and Kim? Is this original thinking comes towards the end like that after years of training?
It could be. You could push your students, though, if you've created a solid foundation towards the beginning. You can push them a little bit harder here. Let me go through the questions here on the side. So for the online instance, so what we're trying to communicate here with this conversation about learning outcomes specifically is that it is critical that you are clear from the very beginning with your students in an online class. You don't have the same opportunities to go in and say, okay, this is what you mean. Does anyone have any questions about the specific, assignment or something like that? So what we're trying to do is make this very, very clear from the very beginning. The same principles that we're talking about learning outcomes here in the online space apply to in-person courses as well. Okay, let's see. Let me work through some of these questions.
Somebody was asking too about the steps. Are they always in this order?
Yeah, so in the updated version, at least, these steps are in order. That doesn't mean, though, that you have to go from remember to understand to apply to analyze, evaluate, create. You can pick and choose which ones are more important to you in that level. Know, though, that as you move up higher, you are assuming that they can, let's say, for example, you have solve this equation. It assumes that they know how to understand and remember too. So that's how that kind of stair works too. It's like they have to have that information before they can do that. You don't necessarily have to have like course level learning outcomes be very specific, doesn't have to break down all of those. You should probably have anywhere from 3 to 7 learning outcomes for your broad course, but you can further kind of operationalize that weekly in the online course, which we recommend, and Quality Matters is an organization that's nationally recognized for establishing quality standards in online courses. They recommend that you have weekly learning outcomes too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add that you don't necessarily have to, kind of like what Kim said, you don't have to go from remember to understand to apply to analyze kind of in the list of the outcomes that you're working. You can just sort of pick and choose based on the level of your course, based on the skills that you're trying to teach, or the knowledge that you're trying to impart on your students. So you can kind of pick and choose these verbs. And just because a verb isn't here doesn't mean you can't use it. So these are just sort of to get you started thinking about the types of tasks that you can use with your outcomes, or the types of verbs that you can use.
And the question was, if you have good in-person class organization, learning outcomes, etc., then you're in a good place for online. Absolutely, I think so. I think that, after our session ends today, our block ends today, we're going to encourage you to look at your own learning outcomes to make sure that they'll work. I wrote down in my notes here that I wanted to mention this, and it seems like a good place for this, that the move to online this semester, did anyone have any trouble with what activities they had originally planned? They just fell flat in the online space? I've heard several stories from faculty where that was the case. And the reason being is that you didn't plan the class to be online from the very beginning. And so when we had to move to the online space, some things were not as successful. And so what we're trying to do is to optimize our success from the very beginning here by looking at our learning outcomes, again, with the online space in mind from the very beginning. So we're trying to avoid the kind of the experience that we had this semester, which was out of our control. And, you know, if we had a crystal ball, maybe it would have been different. But now we have an opportunity to take a look again and try to prepare for the changes and the differences now. All right, so understand. This is really confusing because one of the levels in Bloom's taxonomy is understand, right? That's very confusing. Understand is an action. However, it's not an observable action. I don't know that my students understand something. I have to actually ask them to do something. So what are the things that I would ask my students to do so that they could demonstrate their understanding of something, right? That they understood something. I would have them write a paper. I would have them present on something. I would have them solve some problems. So understand, while yes, a verb is not particularly measurable, and we will encourage you to think of the ways that you would measure understand.
Yeah, the lucky thing is if you do happen to have understand in your outcomes or its close friend know, they're an easy fix. So if you find that maybe your outcomes contain that, or some people are given outcomes from the department to put into their course that they kind of have to follow, these are very quick fixes because you're basically just thinking of, okay, how would I know or how would I learn that they have understood something and use that action verb instead. Todd, you would raise your hand. Todd, do you want to say anything? Or was that a mistake?
That
Sorry.
was a mistake. I
Sorry.
was just
Yeah.
drinking a Diet Coke. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
It seems that all of these learning outcomes are the same for online as face-to-face. Can you explain the difference? I mean, assume, let's say that we were proficient at face-to-face, we've done it. I mean, most of us have. What is the difference then? How do we need to be especially aware of differences in the online space? Thank you.
Yeah, I'd say that the main thing to be mindful of is that your outcomes for an online course should be, I hesitate to say this, but very close to perfect, as close to perfect as possible. Because you want to make sure that you are setting the course up and setting the students up on the right foot right from the start. Because as Kim mentioned earlier, you don't get to sort of, in an online course, you don't always get the chance to sort of set that direction with your first face-to-face class, right? So a lot of folks rely on that first face-to-face class where they're saying, okay, here's all our syllabus, here's what we're going to be doing, here's the point of the course. You have to translate those, that sort of expectation or that sort of preparation into other areas of your online course site and your syllabus. So I'd say that really having those very specific verbs, specific outcomes that are relevant and authentic to what the students want to learn and need to learn. Making sure your verbs are good, making sure your outcomes are clear and student-centered instead of instructor-centered are very important skills there. And they do really, they do kind of match what folks should be doing for an in-person class, but we would just argue that they're even more vital for an online course because students aren't necessarily going to have your guidance to walk them through those first couple important steps of the course face-to-face.
Christian just mentioned too that he had planned to test the students on political geography maps. And so for the online space, that might be a little bit more difficult to do. And so you just might have to rework the outcome itself for the online space. So if it was identify places on a map, it could be that you find a really great tool that facilitates that. But if this was something that was done in person, where you hold up a map for a student, you say, okay, what country is this? What country is that? What is this? That's not going to work anymore. And so then we have to rethink the entire kind of chain, if you will, starting with the learning outcome about what that could possibly be.
Yeah, that's a good point. So sometimes what you have written out for your face-to-face class might not always fit anymore with the online space, or the assessments or the activities that you had planned might change. And then that sort of also leads into changing the learning outcome a little bit, because we'll talk about this more tomorrow morning, but everything should be aligned as good as you can get it. And so sometimes when you make changes to the other pieces, you're going to have to go back and make changes a little bit to what your learning outcomes are focusing on.
Kim and Ashley, I want to follow up on something that Todd had just sort of put on the table, and that is, how do you really transit from one concept or one area to another? This description here, what talks about it, essentially understanding is an action, it's not an observable. But can you not make it observable by for example, after you give a lecture, you solicit feedback from the students. You basically call on some students to sort of respond to some of the concepts you've talked about, or maybe reflect on them, not necessarily regurgitate them, but reflect on them and come up with something sort of interesting to say about what you've said. Aren't you measuring in a way whether they understood the concepts?
So I heard you say two verbs in there. I heard you say reflect and respond.
Yes.
Those to me are better verbs that you can measure. Yeah, so those are better verbs that you can observe than understand. Oftentimes how you can reframe understand is to say, how will I know this? And then usually, when I talk to faculty about this, they'll tell me, I'll say, okay, how do you know this? And then they'll say, oh, I'll have them respond or reflect. And I'm like, there are your verbs there. So ask yourself that question if you have understand here, so that you can maybe, use Bloom's taxonomy too, see if there's a verb in there that pops out to you, particularly there. Yep.
And I think, one of the things that you guys brought up at the very, very beginning of this session this morning about the differences between online learning and face-to-face learning was that with a lot of these synchronous sessions using Collaborate or Zoom, it's sometimes hard to figure out whether your students are understanding you, right? It's hard to read that body language. It's sometimes hard to read their facial expressions, or they're just staring blankly off into space or something. So I think that especially in an online setting, you need to rely on other actions, get the students doing something to show you. Even if it is as simple as sort of, I want to ask them some questions, do a quick knowledge check. And then, you can use Bloom's taxonomy to say, okay, maybe they're going to identify some terms, or they're going to name some important aspects or features of this particular topic or process or whatever it is you're talking about.
Samuel brought up in the chat, I wanted to highlight this. I said, one way to establish the necessity of learning outcomes in my hybrid courses is that I do a syllabus quiz that contains an open-ended question where students have to identify and discuss one learning outcome and their personal goal in relation to that outcome. Helps check in that students are actually reading the document when you can't go over it in class. And also too, it's a low stakes deliverable that introduces students to the testing mechanics of the class before any bigger quizzes or exams. So much good stuff going on here that you've got the students personally relating and they're doing the relevancy work for you. So that R in SMART, they're doing that for you. You can't necessarily tell them or try to get them to see the relevancy in things. We can obviously try, but that's a really great way for them to reflect and say, okay, so what does this mean for me? And how can I connect this to my own trajectory? Awesome. And the low stakes deliverable too. Low stakes things and tasks, we'll talk about this more on block 4, but low stakes tasks are very important in the online space particularly, because it allows them to feel what it's like to take a test. So that by the time they get to the real, to the assessment where they're graded on it, they already have an idea. That's a really great way to do that. Thank you so much, Samuel, for sharing. That was awesome. Yep.
Yeah, I love that idea. That's great. All right, any other questions or concerns before we move on?
Does anyone else have any other ideas of ways that you do this? Like Samuel offered that really awesome suggestion there too.
I think we will move on. So we're going to move on to some sort of activities and applications for you guys. So Kim and I have been doing kind of a lot of talking. We've had some good discussion with you, but we want to get you guys doing a little bit more. So we have an activity for you guys here where we are going to give you a set of outcomes that are maybe not as good as they could be. So thinking about things in terms of using a measurable action verb, thinking in terms of smart goals or outcomes, thinking about higher order and lower order thinking skills and Bloom's taxonomy, and thinking of all of these different things. We want you guys to work together to figure out different ways that how you would fix these learning outcomes. So Kim, we're gonna do breakout groups again, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, so she's setting those up. So we're gonna ask you guys to work in groups and edit and revise these learning outcomes according to the considerations that we've talked about today. We have a Google Doc for you guys, which, let's see, Kim has just sent the link in the chat for you guys. It looks like this. So we have basically what is on this slide here is also here in the Google Drive. So you guys can type your revisions right underneath the original, and so then we'll be able to see everybody's thinking patterns here and all of the different groups. So please, once you are in your groups, you can mark your revisions to the document with your group number, or if you want to create a group name, or however you guys want to do it, you can type that in and then type your revision. And when we come back together, we're going to share thoughts about basically your thought process about what you guys were thinking of and why you revised them the way that you did.
And before you get started, I feel like we should have mentioned this during the first block, but introduce yourselves, who you are, what you teach, and then start moving into these here. All right, I'm gonna create the rooms. I'll be popping in and out again like I did last time. If you have any questions, there's like a button that you can click and I'll come in and answer those. Try to type, don't start at the top, maybe, move some at the bottom, like the anonymous badger is moving towards the bottom a little bit here, which is good. We also too have done this several times before. We're not looking for a specific answer here. There are multiple ways that these learning outcomes can be rewritten. So if someone has already rewritten one that or you're like, that's not clear enough for me, make it clearer then. So the SMART kind of framework is a really good thing to use, as is Bloom's taxonomy. So again, think action, verb, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Mm-hmm. All right, I'm gonna send you away.
Thank you, Group Dan. Appreciate all your help and support. Looks great. Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, Carmen. Thanks, Sheila.
Oh, thank you. Bye.
Is everybody back?
Almost.
Almost. Okay.
It's gonna bring them back in 8 seconds.
Okay. All right. There they go. Okay. All right, cool. Welcome back, everybody. Good work. We were watching you guys fill out the Google Sheet, and we're excited to review it with you. So what we're going to do, just for the sake of time, because we do have another activity that we'd like you guys to have time to complete, is basically we're going to go through each of these 5 outcomes, do a quick kind of discussion about maybe why this outcome could have been improved, what was quote unquote wrong with it. And then have each group share one of their revised outcomes. Okay, so maybe think if you're the spokesperson for your group, if you guys made one, which outcome you guys would like to share that you guys think you did the best job with. So we'll start with the first one. So right here in the center of the screen, students will be able to search the library catalog. So why do we think this one could have been improved? Maybe what was missing, what was wrong with it? What do you guys think? Anybody want to volunteer?
We talked about how it's not measurable, so we just changed it to students will find one source using the library catalog.
Okay, all right, good. So it's a little bit vague, right? If you were to come back and measure this, you know, what exactly are they searching for? Are they going to do something easy like a book? Are they going to do something a little bit harder like a database? You know, what exactly are we looking for here? Are we looking for them to be able to use certain Boolean search tools or anything like that? We don't know. And the students wouldn't be able to know either. So that's an important thing to consider here. Good. So you were group which? What group number?
Group 3.
Group 3. Okay, cool. So we've got here highlighted, students will be able to find one source using the library catalog. So that's a good way to add a little bit more specificity to it. You could even, depending on the course type, you could even drill that down a little bit further to a specific kind of a source that you're really looking for them to use or find. All right. Anybody else want to share their revision of outcome 1? Anybody from a different group? All right, I'm going to move on to 2. So this one was originally saying students will learn the programming language Python. Do we have any volunteers who want to share their thoughts about maybe why this wasn't a super great outcome from the get-go? Sam, go ahead. I see you raise your hand. Sam, do you want to speak? If you are, you're muted. I can't hear you.
Sorry.
Ah, there you are. Okay, perfect.
So one of the things our group discussed, given that none of us actually work with Python, was the way in which the language was a little too vague in terms of what learning the language entails in terms of functionally executing code or other sorts of things. And here's in our own group, identify and demonstrate basic Python commands. That was about the extent of, I think, our collective Python skill. But in terms of action verbs, yes, with group 1. But we were largely talking about the need to think about more action verbs for Python as a process, and then the work that you would be doing within that coding language.
Yeah, perfect. Good. So the main problem with number 2, as Sam mentioned, is it's kind of a little bit too vague to measure. And part of that is because of the choice of verb. So we had talked a little bit about understand and know its close cousin. Learn is kind of in there too, right? So learn is a little bit unobservable, right? Because it's an internal process that's happening somewhere in here. And usually by measuring students' learning, you're going to be asking them to do something, which is exactly what Sam and his group were getting at here with their revision highlighted right here. So identify and demonstrate basic commands would be one way to revise this to make it a little bit more measurable, right? You're focusing on the action that you're going to ask a student to do to show you that they learned how to do something in Python. Great. Anybody else?
That second outcome to me also reads very much like a goal. So to me, that would guide my behavior as an instructor so that I would start to operationalize what it meant for a student to learn the programming language Python. I also don't know a lot about Python. And so, you know, it's an interesting exercise too, to do this as a student coming in, maybe who has no idea what Python is. So I was telling this to a group, if you don't know what this learning outcome means or is trying to communicate, then you can bet that your students will also not know either.
Yeah, it's a good thing to think about. Anybody, any other groups want to share their revision to number 2?
Stephen has his hands up.
Okay.
His hand up.
Sure. So we, and maybe we still could have revised the word learn, but we broke it into 2 pieces that we thought were measurable. The first was students will learn how to code, and I have no idea if there's a level 1. I'll code a level 1 program in Python in the first half of the course. So, but that just puts like a box around the task, right? That you're going to do that. And then the second part of that was a more measurable part. By the end of the second half of the course, students will successfully run their level 1 program in Python. So you're either able to do that or not.
Yep.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say is you could probably chop out "will learn how to," so it would just be students. Well, I guess it's, yeah, students will learn how to. So then the outcome would be at the end of this course, you should be able to code a level 1 program in Python.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Cool.
and that's another thing we had talked about with understand and other verbs that maybe aren't so measurable, that they're an easy fix, or sometimes when you're talking through the process, you'll come up with these other verbs, but sometimes they're right there in the outcome itself, right? So sometimes people will write understand or know how to be able to do a thing. And then that second verb usually is the one you're going to narrow in on for your outcome. So yeah, so you could revise that way. I do like the time boundness of this, these 2 revisions as well, right? Because we're going to spend half of the time doing X, and you'll be able to do that thing by the halfway point, and then the second half you'll be able to do this other more complicated thing. That's great. All right, thank you. Anybody else for number 2? Okay, I'm going to move on to 3. Do you want to do this one, Kim?
One of the families there, one of the members there, there's no. Who has a revision for number 3? I'm seeing a lot of really good ones.
Well, I was a member of group number 10, and we've got couple ideas down here. Nancy, do you want to take the lead, or do you want me to mention it? Identify names and structures of symbols according to the table, and be able to analyze observable effects of certain chemical reactions. We came up with those 2 revisions. So they tend to be much more specific, narrow.
Yeah, I agree. I like too that you have the kind of foundational knowledge about identifying names and structures, and then what happens when these chemicals interact too. So that's really neat to be able to see that kind of authentic application, real life application there. Yeah. And this could be an outcome online. There are lots of different simulations and videos on YouTube that demonstrate like where they would have to analyze the observable effects of certain chemical reactions.
Exactly.
Or you could say, all right, you know, I'm just thinking of the one that I made of a volcano in like 3rd grade, but you know, adding baking soda to vinegar, that's a reaction that I can observe at home if I have those materials. And if I don't have those materials, then I can watch a video online of what that looks like. Yeah, that's awesome. That one looks good. Yeah. Okay, number 4. Students will apply principles of effective communication. Is that David? Do you wanna jump in, David?
Yes, this actually was the most challenging, since communication applies to everything. And, instead of distilling, you know, the importance of communication in a single sentence, that it was so the idea of articulating ideas and concepts in both written and oral form, and engaging the interpersonal and intercultural dimensions of communications.
Okay, so this one, group 9, was you guys? Okay. I want to make sure I show the right one.
Yeah. Whenever I read this one, whenever we do this, I'm always like, what did we mean by that? But that's the point, right? What do we mean by effective communication? And you've nailed it here where you've identified that. It's you know, being an expert, you would be able to further define what effective communication means. But again, this to me is incomplete. As someone who's a total novice in communication and things like that, this is not clear. I don't know what that means. Yeah. Do you have anything, Ashley?
No, I think it's good.
I think ours, the group number 10, is very similar to group number 9. You can see that you can just compare and contrast them to see. We try to emphasize the cultural barriers across cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted to emphasize the cross-cultural communication aspect of it rather than just communication.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
We emphasize the word active listening. You know, listening more than talking is communication also sometimes. Listening to your students, really listening, and teaching your students to listen more.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think this idea of listening is really interesting for me because especially in class experiences with multitasking right now, which is a major challenge for us as faculty. Can students really learn by multitasking, doing something on their computer and listening to you at the same time while you're lecturing? It's a really major challenge for us right now. How far do you want to go in terms of accepting that the students approach to learning through their phones while you're lecturing, their laptops while you're lecturing, and so on and so forth? It's a major challenge. Mm-hmm. So teaching them how to listen in a multitasking environment is really, I think it's very important, and we try to capture that here. Am I right? I think maybe my colleagues in Group 10 may have something else to say on this.
I'll speak up. I think, yes, listening, you know, certainly as a musician, what we bring to listening is so important. And in a multitasking environment, focusing at a deeper level. So I think that's really the bigger challenge always, is to try to get our activities to take us into the depths and not just skimming on a broader surface.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to me, that first one really points to empathy. I think that's, you know, it's a lot of these things that we're asking students to do, you know, particularly looking at the things that you want them to be able to do in 5 years' time, in 1 year time. You know, I think that's a good one to have and to establish in your students. The other thing too about multitasking, research suggests that we are terrible multitaskers. If we use the dual channel processing model to understand and interpret and receive information, we just can't. We are terrible at it. Even us right now, talking, you're seeing my face and you're seeing the screen here is actually overwhelming your reception. So we've become accustomed to kind of filtering out a lot of the noise that we're seeing, or we've just become a lot better at it's the attention bank doesn't get bigger. It's just that the cognitive effort takes less. So we've done this a lot, so it's okay. Anyway, yeah, that's great.
The last one was 5 students will describe marketing techniques and create a marketing plan for a sample organization. Why do you guys think we included this one here? What might be tricky about this? Anybody?
I guess I'll chime in if no one else is willing.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, but we were group 10 and we
were yeah.
splitting it into 2 separate outcomes because it seemed like there was too much, it was too general and,
yeah.
and specific to 2 things.
Yeah, okay, so if you're paying attention, group 10 right underneath. Yeah, this is why we included this one, because sometimes, you know, Kim mentioned earlier, you want to shoot for sort of 3 to 7 outcomes for a course and avoid having too many outcomes. But sometimes people's revision of maybe a long list of outcomes is to clump them together, things that sort of go together, right? Because if you've got this marketing techniques and knowing and just being able to describe what those are and outline the important aspects of those techniques and creating a marketing plan go hand in hand. And yet, if you have students who can do one thing, but they can't do the other thing, then that makes your life really complicated, right? How can you tell whether that particular outcome has been met then? Do you see what I mean? So you want to always make sure that you're kind of picking just one measurable action verb per outcome. So this one was a little tricky. We didn't really kind of outline that before we threw you guys in here. But it looks like some of you guys figured out different ways to go about doing that. Does anybody else have a revision for 5 that they want to share?
Yana, yes.
Yana? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, guys. We were Team Awesome. If you could scroll just a little further.
Here.
Right, so this is a pretty short, very specific outcome. So just much like with a lot of these examples to be written, they were completely vague. So depending on the focus of the course and the discipline under which it taught, in this case, we wrote it as students will design and execute a social media campaign, which is could be a part of marketing strategy. It really depends. It's just a smaller fraction of it. For a local nonprofit organization, we felt that implies the level of engagement that AU is really behind on, and the type of flavor of the kind of work for nonprofit that the students will be doing.
Yeah, great. So it's really tapping into the sort of authenticity of the task you're asking them to do. You're narrowing down sort of the area of the marketing plan and narrowing down who it's going to be made for, which is relevant, right, to a marketing plan as well, or social media campaign, either one. Great. And this is getting more at sort of the second half of it, which was create a marketing plan. So just because you have these 2 verbs in the original doesn't necessarily mean that you need to include both in your course, right? So being able to create or execute a social media campaign for an organization sort of implies that they'll be able to understand the marketing techniques. Oh, sorry, excuse me, this was the original up here. Right, yeah, so Kim's showing on her video, if you can see it, the Bloom's taxonomy, right? So creation of something's pretty much up at the top. So it sort of implies that they're going to be able to understand what those techniques are because they're going all the way up to applying them and using them in sort of a real life authentic situation.
Great. Think about Bloom's taxonomy too, where you have to step on each step in order to get to the top. So this example in particular, you could probably even just chop out that first part, the create a mark. So then it would be students will be able to create a marketing plan for a sample organization. I prefer the one that Team Awesome did because I think it brings in the authenticity part. Yeah, that's the idea. Nancy just said the hierarchical approach. This is less of a hierarchy, more of just like a model that you can use. So it's just for organizational purposes necessarily. This does not assume that creating is better than remembering, right? There's no value judgment on this. This is just to help you so that you can organize and create differences here. You can skip steps on Bloom's, but as long as you have to create that solid foundation here in order to be able to have your students move to the top.
Yeah, and we had talked about making an outcome that's sort of appropriate to the level of your course as well. So for some courses, depending on who they are, who the audience is, what level they're at, the first half of this original outcome might be the relevant half, right? So for some courses, we're just going to focus on what are those techniques and how do you use them, maybe without actually going to that further step of actually applying them. It all depends on the level and the student group. So anybody else for 5? Or anybody else have anything in general to any more thought processes to share for this activity before we move on?
Has anyone heard of scaffolding? So scaffolding is what we're talking about. Let me use the terms that you've probably heard here. So scaffolding is, if we're going to use this this learning outcome here for create a marketing plan for sample organization, scaffolding means that you design your course so that they are able to move up this ladder so that they have all of the tools in their toolkit to be able to create a marketing plan. So think of the analogy of architecture and building a structure. So you're scaffolding things so that we start to build out here. So So we're building the house. So you are the architect of the course and the students are the contractor. Does that help, the analogy?
Okay, all right. So, let's see. Sorry for the lag. I don't know why it's doing that today. Here we go. All right, so we want to sort of close out today with a quick sort of review of what we have talked about for this particular block, and then give you guys a little bit of time individually to kind of take these possibly some new, some not so new guidelines or considerations to your own course learning outcomes. So just a real quick review, kind of what Kim and I have been talking about today. You guys have brought up multiple times today that learning outcomes are always important, which is great because a lot of times we get groups of folks who think that learning outcomes are dumb and nobody wants to do them anyway. So it's great that you guys are already thinking about the importance of learning outcomes for your students and for your course design, and have had a lot of questions about how to apply them to the online setting. And so we wanted to remind you guys that learning outcomes are always important, right? Somebody on the box that for the Miller article activity we did earlier had written "good teaching is good teaching," which I think is one of Kim's favorite quotes also. It's always important to have good learning outcomes, but it's even more crucial and more particularly important for an online course because you're really setting those expectations for a student who, as Kim mentioned before, is kind of in an island, right? They're at home. They're not necessarily in a classroom with you where they're going to feel comfortable reaching out and asking you particular questions. So you want to set them off on the right foot and set them off with that real clear set of expectations and a roadmap of what you guys are going to be doing, what they're going to learn, and how your expectations are for assessing them on how these different things are. Outcomes also help you. They help you set expectations for your students and your course. They help you design assessments, which is what we're going to talk about block 3 tomorrow morning. And they help you choose an instructional strategy, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about choosing the right tools for the activities that you want to do and choosing the right tools to get your students to be able to do these sorts of tasks that your learning outcomes describe. So they kind of inform everything else you're going to be designing for your course. So we asked you guys to bring your course learning outcomes to the session today because we want to give you a little bit of time to take a look at them again. You may have looked at them since the beginning of last semester as you're getting ready to teach for the summer, but we'd like you to take a look at them through the lens of what we've been talking about today. Really, really drilling down, really focusing on, are they clear? Are they written from a student's perspective? Or maybe do they read more like goals? Are they measurable? Do we have any of those sneaky verbs kind of hiding in there, like learn or understand or know? And will you, from a student's perspective, will your students know what to expect if they read this particular outcome? So again, we're not implying that your outcomes aren't great, but we just want to give you guys a little bit of tools on how to critique a learning outcome and kind of see what you've got going for your course so far. Kim, do you have anything to add?
We are going to, or I'm going to be here until 5 o'clock in the room so that if you have any specific questions about something, Ashley and I are good people to talk to. Our expertise lies in many things, but often they do not overlap with what you are expert in. We are pretty much representative of what novices would be, so what your students would be looking at these things. And so I will ask questions based upon, you know, my lack of understanding for, I don't know, physics, right? And so that's kind of nice to be able to ask that too. Even if we are experts in that though, and as instructional designers, we only talk about the design of something. We do not look at the content of something. We are not going to ever value or judge or assess the content. If you deem it to be important to be in your course, we will not tell you otherwise. You are the
Yeah,
subject
can
matter
somebody
expert.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello. You know, I lost my video here, and I'm trying to get it back, and I can't find how I might do that.
It's possible that it's Zoom sometimes for me minimizes to a small square in the right-hand corner of my screen that I can click on to make it bigger again.
Okay, I'll look. But please, I can hear, so please go ahead.
Oh, good. Okay. So you've got 12 more minutes until 4 o'clock. I will be hanging out in the room until 5. I will do my best to work with everyone who wants some time to talk. Stephanie Coe is also another instructional designer is here. Lindsay Suter as well is here to talk about the learning outcomes that you have as well.
Yeah, unfortunately I have to hop off for another meeting at 4, but yeah, if you guys want to ask questions, we are here for you. If you don't have time to stick around, we want to remind you our next session is tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. And for this one, we're going to be talking about activities and assessments in relationship to the course outcomes. So please bring a sample assessment that you have planned, or maybe one you've used before in a face-to-face setting, to that block, and we'll go over that tomorrow.
So an assessment could be an assignment that you have them do, a paper that they write, maybe an exam if you want a challenge, just so we can maybe rethink and reconceptualize for the online space to optimize it for our students' success.
Definitely. All right, great. So I'm going to move it back to these questions real quick, so you guys can get started thinking and started asking us questions. So again, thank you for your attention today. And we are really having fun with you guys and with your good energy and good discussions that we've got going here.
This is great. This is so intense. We know this is intense for you. It's intense for us as well, but we really are enjoying. We were talking in the break that we were having a really nice time doing this. So thank you all so much.
Ashley and Kim, can I say something? It's Kamal.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.